Welcome back to our channel, where we continue to explore the cosmos of Karam. In this world brimming with magic and adventure, our princess is facing challenges like never before. Stay tuned, the excitement is about to begin. Hurried life. Dolph's steps were loud as he ran down the hall towards the sitting room. The six parents, noticing this unusual sound, all paused in their conversation. Jasna stepped forward to check the commotion when the door crashed inward. Splinters flying everywhere. What? The splinters covered the people inside as well as the food, raining down upon everything inside. Rena! Dolph yelled as he entered the room. Dolph's face was covered in worry so strong he looked angry. Even for the shins in the room, it was a frightening sight. The aura he exuded was that of a demon. Shivers were sent down spines as he stomped through the table to get to Karam's mother. "Do you have spiritualist in you, nose to nose?" Rena tensed and began shaking. Just like a Mao can't stand up to a Brin, a Mid-Shin has no chance against even a low Dione. Rena, scared out of her wits, couldn't register his words. His eyes, burning in fury as they stared down at her, were far too strong. Even Jasna and the Dayaks were frozen in place. In humans, it wasn't possible for bloodlust to be felt, but for Former's dark emotions and strong enough will or determination could literally be bottled up. Is there? It hadn't even been 3 seconds since he entered the room, but in his rush he didn't think about the problems he might be causing, or that they might need time to register what he was asking. The only one who had his wits about him was Embark. Dolph limits. Dolph turned to him after a second. The aura disappeared to a fog that covered the room. He didn't let go of Rena's collar as he asked again. He was calmer, but still a hurried demon. "Spiritualist, is it possible you am?" Rena faltered and glanced at Embark. Why? She didn't even get the chance to finish the one-syllable word before Dolph let go, and she fell back onto the couch. Dolph turned to Embark. "Get Basil." Jasna gasped at the fact that a soldier would dare give an order to his father, and to even summon her. But he didn't say anything when he noticed Karam in Dolph's arms. Instead, it was forgotten as his mind turned to try and find an explanation for why his daughter looked like she was dead. Where's Geronimo? Pharrell looked around for his own child, expecting a similar stance in his own child. Embark flew out of the room at Dolph's command. "What did you do?" Jasna stepped forward and reached over the couch for his daughter. Dolph pulled away and ignored his question. He apologized to the room for not holding back and then turned to Rena. "How much spiritualist, the higher the better." Rena hesitated and glanced around the room, but seeing the anxiety on the usually laid-back Dolph and her daughter in his arms, unmoving, she decided to go out with her biggest secret. "My father, my real father, was a spiritualist." Her bold statement made the room pause. Is she going to be all right? Rena reached forward and brushed Karam's face, her fingertips, just before Dolph turned around. "Geronimo is fine with that." He left the room. They heard him call for the worker as he left. The room was left in shock, confusion, and messy. What? Bracken in the hallway. Bracken paused in front of Dolph. "Do you know where the Hakase is being held?" Bracken's eyes widened at the sight of Karam lying limply in Dolph's arms. "Do PRDGA." She was unable to get any coherent words out, partially due to surprise, and partially because she isn't used to talking. "She'll be fine. I need you to get Hakase. Remember him?" Bracken nodded enthusiastically. "He's in lockup. Know where that is?" She started to nod but instead shook her head. After giving her instructions, he told her where to meet him and they parted ways. Dolph made his way back through the throne room, which connects everything to the medical bay. It's unusual to have a room for this specific purpose, but because the castle used to be the boundary line, The room was large enough for an army. Most of it used now for spiritualists. This is actually quite convenient, because the spiritualists act as this world's doctors. Dolph burst through the door. Without breaking at this time of the med bay. "Give me a bed." While laying down Karam on the closest bed, he explained. "The young princess is hurt, but I do not want it spread around. Everyone who is in here will stay in this room until I say otherwise." Inside were people in robes with a walking around or sitting with a book in hand. Papers, pencils. Research books had replaced most of the medical equipment. In the long room, beds lined up along both walls. "The young princess, what's wrong with her? Is there anything we can do to help? Who are you to keep us here?" Worried expressions and questions followed his brief explanation, and the crowd multiplied. One female spoke up against his authority. The spiritualists, who had been previously enslaved, loved the new hope and what she stood for, but there were those who were uncertain about the new change. "In name of the royal family, specialists are on their way, please give her room. Move to the other end of the room." He raised his voice to be heard over the spiritualists. Though this didn't fully satisfy the female, she did as he asked with the rest of her group. Like most spiritualists, she wasn't outspoken. "Specialists apart from us." It wasn't long until Hakase showed up behind Bracken. He was being drugged by the Bracken, who was slightly shorter than him. "What's happening? What is she? What's wrong?" He hurried over to the bed once he glanced her through the uneasy crowd. What happened? What did you do?" Immediately placing the blame on Dolph, he checked her pulse. He didn't understand the words he spoke, but understood the meaning behind the glare he was tossed. "She ate this." Dolph opened his hand to reveal an oblong white fruit. It was shaped like an almond, but was about 5 centimeters long. He glanced at it before snatching it from his hand. "She ate a Greg horn," he yelled at Dolph. "These are dangerous. Why did you let her eat it?" He held it up in front of Dolph's face and yelled at him before tossing it away. "You don't do that," he yelled at him. The spiritualists around them gasped and again began whispering to one another. "Rena's half spiritualist. But I don't know about her, her soul I know." He growled. Hakase turned to the spiritualists. "You guys have any research on this? I need to see it." Spiritualists were looked down upon. Their knowledge was never appreciated. Thinking that a former might crack open a book was a pipe dream. It never happened. So for a former in a time of crisis to be willing to take the time to read, it was an unthinkable action for a moment. They weren't sure how to react. Then one of them spoke up. "That's Cesarina Derzi. Right, YA, she knows the Greg horn fruit the best." The woman called Cesarina Derzi had already pushed through to her research table and grabbed a book. "I got it here. I've written down everything I know about them. General knowledge is within the first 10 pages. General experiments are on the next." A girl with short, bouncy hair reached through the crowd with a rustic binder in hand. She began explaining the form they use in all their edible journals to him. "I know. I just need to know what other plants it matches with. I just need pages 414 and 67 through 72 if you have it." Hakase accepted the book and began through it. It was thin, maybe 30 pages. But they didn't count pages by how many papers filled the book. "Why yes, of course." Hakase was already glancing through pages. Mumbling to himself, he flipped to the right places in the book, as if he knew what he was doing. At this point, most of the spiritualists' attention was on him. Some of them had forgotten about the young princess entirely. It was like seeing the school's jock and muscle head get the highest grade in school even when everyone knows he's a dense idiot. It was something that simply didn't happen. Medical life. "I need mushu concoction and herring needle." After a few moments, Hakase raised his head also. Is anyone studying the eastern low trees? I need boiling water and a rag gauze. And regular ointment. Everyone began to frenzy. Going through books, ointments, and other things around the room to see if anything could help. I have unagi, it'll counteract effects of. Could you use research on the Houthi? Here's the gauze, this can clear the stomach. Won't drown. I am. Their medical capabilities are vast. I am studying their reactions to eastern Dolph ants. What's boiling water? I have the Mushu concoction. I have needles. I have tist needles. What about vasopits? Hakase accepted the bottle. Only herring. Do you have any unpolluted vegetarian sap from the low tree? I'll check. Everybody back up. I need some room. Needles, herring needles. We don't have any. Hakase cursed. He stood up. Then I need. The hustling continued until Hakase finally decided he had everything he needed. Okay, he yelled loudly enough for everyone to hear. By this time the crazy offers and running around had calmed down, as they understood that he knew what he was doing. Though none of them could figure out the reason for his own action. Everyone cover your ears. Don't stop until I give the okay. Stand back. I'm about to start. Dolph, keep mixing that. I'm going to pour this in. This might hurt you a bit. With that, Hakase guided his own concoction into the hardening Mushu, and began whispering to himself. Hungtongi huntaji furomentatayo we branict glidadora. He repeated the phrase a few times before the concoctions were mixed. One of the spiritualists, who had removed their hands from the ears, had begun screaming. Hakase didn't even glance at him. Dolph, who was listening, had a look of discomfort on his face, but continued to stir. The mixed brown and dull blue substances began to turn purple. As that happened, Hakase stilled Dolph's hand. Still chanting, he took it from him and turned to set it back on the table. Without pausing in the chanting, he motioned for them to uncover their ears. His chanting continued. Dolph's face cleared, but the screaming didn't stop. Dolph and Hakase communicated to leave him alone with their eyes, but the Hakase didn't look away from the potion. Other than that, Hakase continued to chant continuously for about another 5 minutes. His only other action was checking Karam's pulse. The door opened in the middle of his chanting. Marak and a full-bodied mature woman walked inside. The spiritualists crowding around Hakase parted ways as the king entered. The only other sound was Hakase chanting and the weeping spiritualist. He didn't glance at them either. Hakase continued his chanting. 2 fingers on Karam's wrist. Has the secret to immortality already been discovered? Impervious to the aura in the room. The woman looked carefully over Karam, with a casual lifting of her brow. She spoke as if she were asking about slightly unusual wind direction. While a storm was being brewed, it was obvious there were more important things. But she didn't seem to notice them. Marak shook his head and pointedly looked at Hakase and Karam each in turn. Understanding fell over the woman's face, and they stood back to allow Hakase to finish. After another 30 seconds, the Hakase suddenly scooped up the bottle and began pouring it into Karam's mouth. Still chanting woe, the woman jolted forward and pushed her hand between Karam's mouth and his blue concoction. The Hakase chanting became angry as he looked at the woman in surprise and fought to allow it in. Stop! The woman held her hands over Karam's mouth. Her body can't hold up to a pregnancy. One of the spiritualists called out in shock. Hakase shook his head and shook the hardening liquid in his hand. He pointed to Karam's stomach and shook his head. He couldn't stop his repeated chant, and looked at the liquid with worry. It was turning a musty brown. He gestured for her to move once more. No. That thing is not entering her. No way. What's wrong? Hakase moved forward again, intending to pour it through her hand. It required. Something pressed against his temple made him pause. He looked up at the woman, who was holding the mechanism, to his head, and glared at her before glancing into the bottle of brown liquid. He sighed and stopped his chanting, more annoyed than scared, like he probably should have been, with a gun to his head. He turned and set the bottle on the table behind him. I said it wouldn't. Don't kid with me. One body can't hold two consciences. The woman moved Karam's body nearer her on the bed, and straightened the chemical gun to his head. It's a parasite, like a tapeworm, not a baby. Do you understand that? If we can get it in her before the 30-minute marker, we might have a chance. You're just some stupid former. She paused and leaned over Karam to stare at Hakase's torso. What the hell? Hakase paused slightly, staring at her large breasts, which spilled partially out of her top as she bent over. What? She backed up and looked at him incredulously. What are you? You aren't spiritualist, but you aren't former either. She looked again at his torso. Hakase laughed nervously. You can see that. That's a little embarrassing, Basil. What's happening? Can you help her? Dolph interrupted their chat, seeing as their talk was getting off topic. I don't know yet, but don't let him near her. She pointed rudely at Hakase. Hey, I said whoa. Dolph immediately picked him up by the collar and tossed him over the crowd without a second thought. With him gone, Basil, the woman began to look Karam over. She looked at the palm of her hand, turned her over and glanced at her back, opened an eye and peeked into her mouth. After checking a few other things, she stood back. Well, she smacked her lips together. You know, Dolph, I've never seen you so anxious. You in love with his girl? What? He paused and looked at Basil like she was crazy. Can you help her? Basil shrugged. I think so. There's something weird going on. You okay with her becoming another person? Wait. Some of those can stay. Hakase pressed through the crowd. Dolph stopped him. What do you mean, former spiritualist souls? And Greg Horn, those have got to be what you see. You can see that, right? Hakase struggled to pass Dolph. How did you know? Because you could see through me, Dolph. Let him through. I want to hear what he had to say. What's a soul? She watched his from across the bed. It's something special. He glanced up at Mirak to see if it was all right to reveal the information. We both should have it. If I remove mine from my body for a short time, would you be able to identify it? Could that help? Sure. If I can tell what I can remove or change them. Okay, I'll remove it for exactly 4 seconds. Watch carefully. She nodded her head, smiling. Can you really? Hakase put his hands together over his chest. Yes. He took a deep breath. He exhaled slowly, his whole body relaxing. For a moment he didn't move, his lips still in the form of an O. His body froze for about 4 seconds. While Basil sighed, she looked around the room, as if she saw something that nobody else could. Hakase suddenly opened his eyes and Basil climbed on top of the bed. Got it, I got it now. She wants to get rid of hers, right? Her eyebrows furrowed in concentration as she straddled Karam and put her hands on her stomach. No, she wants to keep it. The Greg Horn is what is wrong. Oh. She shrugged and got off the bed. Well then, I'll just do this. Wait, Basil. Don't. Dolph reached out to grab the hand touching Karam's temple, but by the time he was reaching, she had already pulled away. They're all done. Dolph gulped and looked at her. Did you yet? Basil smiled. She's like me now. Mirak furrowed his brow. Dolph sighed and began shaking Karam. Kara, wake up. Kara, what happened? Hakase couldn't understand the worry in Dolph's eye. Karam let her sleep. Basil glared at Dolph. She had just done a miracle surgery on the young princess. She should be given a reward, not brushed off. It'll only enhance her spiritualist abilities a bit. She explained to Hakase. It won't kill her. What? The Hakase eyes widened. You merged it. He yelled at her, worry taking over his face like it had Dolph's. She could die. We don't know how a soul will react to that. It's fine. Basil waved her hand in front of her face, as if to brush the panic away. Instead, what was that trick you did? Can you teach it to me? Hakase scoffed at her and opened back up the binder about the Greg horn. Dolph continued to try to wake Karam. Kara, wake up. Basil pouted and left the room. The other spiritualists watched their bodies tense. They hardly dared to breathe. Some of them might be unsure if the new hope was a good thing. But not one of them could say that they wished for her to die. New life. Embark watched quietly as Dolph tried to wake his granddaughter. Not too long after Basil stormed out of the room, Karam began to stir. Kara, are you all right, are you? Karam gasped and held her head. She began to scream in pain. Everyone in the room gasped and looked over at the young princess. She curled into a ball. Her screaming died out and she laid there, gasping and moaning. In the corner of the room, Rena jolted within Jasna's arms. They had come after Dolph, but didn't dare get in the way of anyone who could help. Instead, Jasna held his wife to his chest and rubbed her head, as they watched through gaps in the crowd. Even now, she clung to him but didn't move any closer. She couldn't dare see her daughter in pain. She averted her eyes and buried her face in his chest. Jasna, who was known to be cold, had an expression on that looked like a father watching his daughter suffer. It was probably the first time he had acted like a father to her. Yet no one would ever see it, as they were all too focused on Karam. What can I do? What's wrong? Dolph hovered over her, stroking her head. Karam, just tell me what to do. She gasped again. Dolph leaned forward. After taking another breath, Karam opened her mouth again and screamed. Where's my fucking morphine, bastards? The spiritualists paused. Get me a Rignil. Hakase yelled and hurried around to the other side of the bed. Toss it. He caught a jar of red powder and scoffed. No water. He glanced around, but there wasn't time. If she was in pain, then this is what could help. Ishi, smell this. It's. Karam grabbed a bottle and snuffed it. After that, she tossed some of it down her throat. Very strong. Hakase finished a second later. He had meant for her to only take in a few particles of the substance, yet she downed the entire thing. That's one hell of a dosage, he mumbled to his elf. Karam tossed the empty bottle over her shoulder onto the bed behind her, and curled back into her ball. It's not working, Ga. She began moaning again, and her breathing sped up. Hot, I'm so hot. She moved away from Dolph, who was sitting next to her on the bed. She rolled off the bed and laid on the floor, cheek to the ground. Embark moved out of the way. Too hot only because you ate the Rignil, Hakase mumbled. She sighed and stretched out on the smooth stone. What happened? You ate a rig, Dolph tried to explain. You drank drug, Hakase talked over Dolph. You idiot. Watch what goes into your mouth. If you die, it's not on me this time, he scolded her. Not holding back, I didn't. She moaned again and rolled over. So cold. Don't do drugs anymore. She kept her eyes closed. You are lucky these guys don't know what a drug is. Either way, don't eat things you don't know about. I ate ham and mart, she mumbled. A mart was a similar looking nut to the Greg horn. Mart. Embark furrowed his brow and hurried off. They must have been mixed together. Dolph shook his head and looked down at her from on top of the bed. Can we turn off the lights at least? A few of the spiritualists took down the lights on the walls, which was actually a bug-type animal. Dolph slid off the bed and knelt down next to the bed. Why, they are off now. Karam opened her eyes, but quickly pulled them shut. She rolled under the bed. The hell they are. Shut the windows. She gasped and moaned again, before muttering to herself. The hell? She crawled out from under the bed next to Dolph, and scanned the crowd with a weird look on her face. Her parents made their way through the crowd and emerged just as she scanned over them. Karam, what's wrong? Dolph bent down to look at her face. She looked him up and down and backed away, nothing. She slid back under the bed while watching Dolph. She looked at him as if he were a giant. Disgusting bug. Hakase turned around to the crowd and waved them away. I think she needs her rest now. Can everyone just... Thanks. The 20 or so spiritualists dispersed. The sheet that hung in between each bed was pulled out as far as it could go so as to give them as much privacy as possible. Under the bed, Karam watched them move about. Hakase and Dolph looked at each other. Their expressions didn't need explaining. They both knew that the Greg Horn did strange things to people. If a Greg Horn were to be eaten by a former, there is no doubt that person would die. But because Karam is part spiritualist, there was a chance that the energy in the fruit could mesh with her own. The chances of this are slim. Within 50 spiritualists, only 2 or 3 would survive having eaten the fruit. It is said that if someone survived the process, their consciousness or spirit will reach its peak form. The reason spiritualists study isn't simply enjoyment. The more they expand their knowledge, the more the power of their spirit is said to grow. Having more spirit to control is the spiritualists' way of growing. Their thirst for knowledge coincides with their desire to live, for if one's spirit drops too low, they will cease to appear. If you think of them as a mixture of mana and hit points, then you've probably got a pretty clear view of what spiritualist is. Of those who have eaten the fruit and lived, 3 have gained limitless spirit without knowledge. All of the others have gone mad. One of those is Basil. After tasting the forbidden fruit, she claims she can see things. Over the months and years, those around her come to believe that instead of finding something fascinating within her, she has instead gone mad. This happened when she came to the king almost 20 years ago and claimed that evil things were invading the land. She was pushed away and ignored. But after she began killing children, Barak's father could take it no longer and banished her. Today is the first day she has been back within kingdom limits since then. Basil entered the room and walked straight to the bed. Dolph watched, but Hakase made a sour face. Young princess. Basil bent down and looked under the bed. Hi. I'm Basil. Barak sent me to help you. Grandfather did. She nodded first. I want to ask you some questions, is that all right? Karam didn't reply. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Basil turned and picked out a green, gooey fruit from her basket. Do you know what this is? No. What about this one? Do you know what this is? She pulled another from the basket. No. What about this? Basil pulled out a little statue made of rock. A troll. What about this one? Do you know what this is? Basil pulled out a bug in a jar. It was a common bug, like a fly or a spider. In all her life, there was no way she hadn't seen one. No. Do you know what happened? Why your head started hurting and why you are here? No. One more question. What do I look like? What do I look like? Do I look and sound like a woman, or maybe a beast? Do I just look like a few dots? Maybe I'm see-through. Karam was weary of all these questions. Like lights, I guess. Veins of lights, really? Basil asked, surprised. Karam furrowed her brow, unsure what the meaning behind all these questions were. Who did you say you were again? Sorry. I got a little carried away. Should I tell you what these things are? Basil motioned to the lineup of things in front of her. This is a local fruit called gaknik. She pointed to the green fruit, and then the one that looked like a mango. This is a fruit called Honda. I hear you like it. This is a stone statue. This is a jinx. What? Most of what she said were words and things she recognized, but somehow they didn't look like what she remembered them to be. Young princess. You ate something about this big that was white. Do you remember why the mart? Basil shook her head. It wasn't a mart, what you ate was a Greg horn. The Greg horn went into your core and melded with your spirit. That's the reason you can see things now. You are seeing the same things. They just look different here. Try the fruits. Basil handed her the gaknik hesitantly. Not all sure this wasn't a trick to get her to eat poison. She broke the peel with her fingernail and sniffed. Glancing at the friendly face of Basil once more, she sucked out some of the goo. Wait, so why does everything feel like another world again? Because you ate the Greg horn. You're lucky, Marak, and I kept in touch. That other guy was just about to make you pregnant. With your little body you wouldn't last. I was not. It was a parasite, and I have a name, you know. Go away, I'm getting connections. Basil's true intentions slipped free as she snapped at Hakase. Basil, I think I can take it from here, Dolph said. No way. How do you think she's going to react when she sees you like that? What do you think she's going to say when she finds out who you are? Dolph hesitated. He still wasn't sure if Basil had done the right thing or if she really had gone mad. Like the rumors say she had viewed life. After calming her parents down, Karam dismissed herself to get some much-needed rest. She hadn't told them everything. There had been changes, noticeable changes. Since she ate that white horn nut thing, everything she saw was different now. When she woke up, she felt like she was staring into the sun. Inanimate objects were mostly unchanged, but living things lit up. For instance, Dolph was a glowing swirl of dark colors. She could still see his physical form, but it was as if there was something else there. Something just beneath the surface. It was as if she were looking at two things at once. Like rocks through clear green water. It was strange, and honestly disturbed her more than finding out Dolph cared for her, which sent shivers down her spine, but still made her chest feel warm. Something that had changed when she downed that horn nut. Even before she opened her eyes, she knew who he was and where he was. She knew Hakase and Dolph were standing by her side, just like you know where your hands are without looking down to make sure it's still hanging by your side. She felt as if, along with the weird swirling lights in everyone and sixth sense, something else was there. It was only a feeling, but she could feel something else. It was old and powerful. It wasn't made. It almost seemed as if it had been a part of her to start with, and she was just tapping into it. It was like a memory she hadn't known she'd known. It happened whenever she looked at something or thought about something. She could tap into these hidden memories and gain insights into them. For instance, she knew why the colors in Dolph were dark and why her mother's had 3 separate colors. Even knew what the colors mean. Hell, she even knew the materials of a cot she'd never seen before. She knew with a single glance that the metal holding up the cot wasn't actually a metal, and why it was so seamless. Sure, it looked like one and sounded like one, but it wasn't from the earth. It was from a tree. This tree, when young, drips white mucus from its leaves. It soaked from the white, clouded leaves and into the ground, covered in a similar colored moss. Then ate the seepage while it was still new. It soaked it up within hours. When this moss dies, it becomes stiff and hard, but fragile. It crumbles as animals walk on it or winds pass through, and eventually seeps back into the dirt to return to the earth and become part of the next thing that comes along. That white seepage from the leaves is what makes the metal they use in this world. If one can catch it before it seeps into the moss, then it will become moldable. Like Play-Doh, if used correctly over time, it can become a cheap and sturdy piece of anything you want it to be. Karam knew this just as she knew how to make orange juice. It was as if she'd learned it as a child. As if it were common sense. It wasn't just materials. Either when Karam first looked at Dolph, She knew that the grays slipping in and out of her light vision was actually blue and orange. She knew that if he could train to use the most of those thinner bits in him, then his clouded figure wouldn't seem so unnatural. Instead, he'd be able to accent his natural talents and become an even greater fighter. She also felt that he wouldn't feel so wrought down with dissatisfaction and self-hatred. Karam glanced around her empty bedroom. She sat up in bed and held her hand out in front of her. After staring at her hand a moment, a burst of spirit essence took on a physical form in the center of her palm. It looked like it was an out-of-focus ball hovering over her hand. She touched it and felt that it felt soft, as if she were touching a pillow or a fluffy animal. She wasn't surprised by the texture, but instead found that she'd already known what it would feel like before she'd even begun the process of creating it. This was an ancient technique, used by the original formers to create forms for themselves and the spiritualists. It wasn't practiced now like it had been back then. Never in thousands of years had an energy been so pure, so perfect. Despite the legendary miracle she had in her hands, there was no excitement in her eyes. Instead, she seemed bored. Karam sighed and closed her palm around the blurry sphere, making it pop and disperse life. Karam looked at the ceiling and closed her eyes sadly. Isn't very fun when you already know everything. End of life. The next morning it was a clique. Too normal for it to possibly be real. The woman gulped nervously and looked it over again. It was real, there was no denying it. It was right there in her hands, hard, solid proof the world was about to end. She started pacing. Her long red hair swirled around her as she turned abruptly to pace to the other wall. Her freckled clear white skin paired with her green eyes and unusual colored hair gave her an exotic beauty. Her thin brows were pushed up as she worried. Her plump lips pressed together. What should she do? What was it that she could do? She had to think of something. She had to think fast before. The door was pulled open and a brunette woman walked in carrying a plate of food. She was tall and beautiful. Her simple white dress washed out her face, but accented her curves. The way she walked proved that she was well taught in the form or martial arts, and was probably at least a low shari. What's wrong, Yazin? You look like you've just seen a ghost, she asked brightly. Yazin quickly hid the paper behind her and greeted her sister with a tight smile. Sabine, nothing's wrong, she shook her head. She glanced around the room looking for an excuse. Or should she tell her? Should she share the news that could end their life? Sabine sighed and set down the tray of food. I know what this is about. Yazin tensed. How could she know? Did Sabine see the note? No. She was by her side until they split. There's no way she could have right. Yazin gulped and looked at her sister. This is about Dolph, isn't it? Sabine sighed again and cocked her head to the side, tossing a hand onto her hip. If it is, then you don't need to worry. I already know his back. Did you really think you could hide that from me? He made quite the ruckus last night. Yazin's shoulders dropped. She was relieved, but somehow also guilty. I shouldn't have kept it from you. Sabine waved her hand. It's fine, what's done is done. Here's the young princess's food. I'll be back for her bath. Yazin slid over in front of the bed. Right. Of course. Her tight smile appeared on her face again. After Sabine left, her shoulders dropped. She turned around to an empty bed and glanced at the paper in her hands once more. Now what am I to do about this? On the paper was precise handwriting. Everyone, I'm going away. I've grown bored here and need to feed my genius. If needed, make another Karam. She might not be a genius, but Hakase can help. I'll be back in a few years. P.S. Dolph, you follow me and I will fire you, then throw you in the kingdom beyond the mountains. P.P.S. In case of emergency, contact Rashid. Yazine felt like crying. She had no idea what to do. After thinking it through for almost an hour, Yazine stood up and made her way to the throne room. If anyone was to do something about this, it would be the man in charge. Life changed. Karam looked her naked body up and down. She was still a toddler. So she didn't have any sex appeal yet, but she knew she was still adorable. Her face, at least. She glanced at the door. She was currently hiding out in an empty room in the castle. It was actually the room next to one of her aunt's rooms. But the dust proved that it hadn't been used for quite some time. The perfect place to hide. After making certain nobody was coming, she turned back to her current problem with a dull expression. First things first, I guess. Karam moved from the mirror and held onto a chair nearby. She sighed and put her hands by her side, palms facing inwards. Taking a deep breath and straightening herself, she began her work. Slowly her legs began to grow. Taking the chair's material and adding it to herself. She was the size of an adolescent by the time the chair was gone. Karam moved down from the chair and stepped back in front of the mirror. Her small pudgy legs were now long and thin. Her hips were a little bigger, and her chest had grown out slightly. Her waist was still small, but she looked as if she'd aged 10 years in a single moment. Karam stutters, her image may be a little too thin. I was also hoping for something a little older. Karam glanced around the room. There was only a couch left in the room, which was too large. After a second, she spotted a small stand next to the couch. Perfect. She'd gotten the majority of her mass from the chair. So if she could just add a little more. She grabbed the small table and pulled it next to her in front of the mirror. It was just tall enough for her to set her hand on top of it as she stood. She cocked her head at her appearance. Okay. A little more in the chest. More leg and certainly more hip as she spoke. Her appearance changed almost as if it were obeying her. Add a little more shape and taada. Karam's words were lively, but her voice was flat and boring. It was obvious that despite the never-before-seen magic she'd just performed, she wasn't feeling excited in the least bit. She took a few more minutes gliding her fingertips over her body. In some parts she tightened to make it more youthful. In others she thinned or muscled up to add toning. She even changed her face. Instead of the large, seductive eyes she would have grown into, she narrowed them into beautiful almond-shaped eyes and thickened her lashes a few millimeters onto the top of her little nose, and thinner after all. She couldn't be too perfect, but still full and luscious lips. Her last touch for her base was higher cheekbones and a smaller chin. Even Karam had to admit her good work at this point. She looked like a model, perfect, maybe a little too perfect. After a thought, she drug her finger down her chest at a slant. A nasty large scar appeared. Gross. Perfect. Karam nodded emotionlessly. She looked down at what was left of the table. There was almost half left, which was far too strange to leave behind. Her hand that had been on it the entire time was the only thing holding it up. Of course, she could always remake it, but she had a better idea. Karam bent down and gently touched her other hand to the table. When she pulled it away, a string, almost like it was drawn to her, stretched out between her hand and the stand. Karam's hand pulled away, leaving the strand crossing past her in the mirror. She moved her hand up slightly, and the string stretched and covered her front. Only a moment later, Karam had woven herself a flowing, simple dress. It was thin, with accents on it converging at the top of the dress. The skirt was vaguely transparent through the light, giving it a hint of sexuality, but the skirt itself was a single layer and wide, meaning that it would flay outwards as she moved, but as she stopped and were to sit, there wouldn't be extra fluffing fabric she'd have to worry about. For the top, she boldly created a low V-neck. showing proudly the scar on her chest. The opening slid down near her belly button, showing its entirety. The scar, about 20 centimeters long, the top just misformed the top of her right breast. Karam glanced at her hair. It was light blonde. She drew the color from her hair to sweep it into her clear skin to give it a healthy glow. Karam didn't bother changing her red eyes. Those she was truly happy to have, even if she couldn't feel happiness anymore. Life plans. Karam was just about to leave when she sensed a change in Dolph's emotional state. She'd been keeping an eye on it. If anyone were to block her path, it would be him. Her hand paused only a second to process it and change her plans before she turned it and stepped out into the hallway. She moved through the hallways with pride. Her calm eyes and lifted chest showed that she was a highly established person, especially if she were acting like so within the castle of the kingdom. Normally, one will act as if the owner of the home is next to you at all times. The most powerful person, after all, has the right to behead you if you aren't acting humbly. But when one acts as if that doesn't matter, then it must mean their stance is higher than the owner. In this case, the king himself. It was a nearly unimaginable thought after all. Kings are famously the most powerful person in their kingdom. That's why they are given the throne, yet this rule, law and religious practice didn't apply to Karam. As she moved through the halls, anyone within sight stopped and stared until long after she was gone. Not only were her actions brash, but her beauty astounding, the sort reserved for gods. Karam quickly walked down one hall, then through a room and 3 more halls until she finally came to the room she was looking for. She quickly yet gracefully pushed through the doors. 2 of Karam's aunts and 1 of her cousins were in the room with the king. Her cousins, who were still only toddlers, were playing on a rug as her aunts spoke and laughed on a couch on one side of the room. Embark sat casually on a windowsill staring out through the wide opening leading straight 3 floors down. As they didn't have glass, it was a dangerous and bold position. But that shouldn't bother someone as high-powered as a king. Therefore, such openings were generally reserved only for rooms in the castle within, which were only for the king. Having a window meant prestige. One of her aunts gasped at her. "What do you think?" Her words slowly trailed off. Karam didn't even bother glancing at her out. They got up and scurried out, pulling the children behind them. Karam slowly walked into the room, the baby, which they just now realized they'd forgotten in their rush to obey, suddenly lifted into the air and flew through the open doors. It landed gently in its mother's arms. Karam's aunt looked up with teary, thankful eyes just before the doors slammed shut without any obvious signs of being touched. Now alone, Embark took his time observing the stranger that has so rudely barged into his private room. He looked her up and down, even felt for her aura, but couldn't summon up any memory of who it might be. She must have power beyond anything he knew if she was able to find him in this room. Not even his servants knew exactly where he was, yet she burst through, assured he was there. Slowly he rose from his position, taking caution. "Grandfather, I've come to discuss something of great importance." Karam's indifferent voice sung throughout the room. Embark sighed and his shoulders relaxed, something Karam wouldn't have noticed before, as it was such a slight movement. "Only one calls me by that name. The Greg Horn has given me knowledge, even so as to change my given form." She didn't bother motioning towards her obvious change in appearance. "I plan to use it to save the world," she spouted bluntly. Had it been anyone else listening to her, they might have physically choked on her words. Yet Embark hardly moved a muscle. "You seem capable enough." Embark raised an eyebrow. His eyes showed his thoughts. "If you've already decided, what are you telling me for?" Karam read the thoughts in his mind and replied simply, "Dolph intends to find me and follow me to the ends of Sunajunki." Maybe even to Earth if I so wish to go. She paused. He can't come with me if he's to stay safe. If I leave, as it is, he's bound to recognize me. He's read my letter and is on his top guard. After all, Marak sighed and stood up. He turned to look back out the window. I see. You want me to stop him? Karam didn't reply. She didn't feel a need, when he was only restating what she'd said. The room was silent for a time before. I won't. He turned around. If you want to journey, you will take with you the strongest man in the kingdom. My trusted aide. Karam looked at him. A smile hidden behind her sparkling eyes. You speak of two different men. She was amused. Did he truly believe she did not know? Even after he's seen her shape change. Marak watched her in silence for a moment before doing something totally unexpected. Marak, the hard, cold king, laughed. I was unsure, but it doesn't seem to have changed your personality. I'm glad. He turned back to the window with a lingering smile. Granddaughter, I hope you bring that boy with you. He's brighter since he's gotten to know you. He's not one to use his strength if it isn't absolutely necessary. Yet with you passed out in his arms, he showed me a side I'd never seen before. He closed his eyes as if reliving the moment. He took in a deep breath before his face fell back into a deadpan expression, and he looked suddenly at Karam. I am going to ask you one day to take my place on the throne. When I do, I hope you will accept the position with Dolph by your side. His eyes were serious, haunting. Even Karam smirked. You know, I've always wanted a crown. Gold, maybe, she joked. But she didn't miss the unspoken words to have Dolph by her side. He needed to be alive. Marak's smile returned. Get out of here, child. Their business was done. He'd said his part, but he wasn't able to enforce it. Not with her abilities. He could only trust her judgment. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. The wind blew the heavy doors wide open, revealing a small crowd who'd obviously been listening at the door. Many of them fell over as the door swung free. Their eyes were wide after being caught. Karam didn't spare them a glance. Of course, she already knew they were there. As Karam stepped past them, she winked at Yazin, who was watching her with pure unabashed awe. Somehow, on her way to deliver the letter, she got caught up in the gossip of a beautiful woman who seemed to know the king and were currently alone in a playroom together. The two aunts from earlier who'd spread the news, and one or two other servants, were the only ones who didn't watch Karam all the way as she left and instead saw another, more amazing scene. The king is smiling. Just who was that woman? Life mission. Bracken ran down the steps of the castle entrance and straight into Dolph on her way down. Her large, curvaceous body jiggled and shook as she rammed front first into his back. Dolph heard her coming, but didn't move out of the way, as he was focused on the scenery before him, looking for any sign for Karam. Finally coming to a stop, she began pulling at Dolph in a hurry, trying to get him to come with her. She was obviously panicked about something. Dolph, though, wouldn't budge. There was no way he was about to let Karam get away, unless it was for a disaster-sized emergency. What is it, girl? Speak. Bracken stopped and turned back, her hand still grabbing at his shirt. She stared with wide eyes at the front doors before finally turning to explain. She took a deep breath and looked straight into his eyes. This alone showed just how highly she viewed him. Bracken was calm enough and open enough, and that doesn't happen for just anybody. In fact, it happens quite rarely. Why, a young princess SSSK, her letter, I know. He glanced back around the field briefly before turning back, and once again giving her his full attention. Is that what this is about? She shook her head roughly. Dolph furrowed his brows. You know where she is? Bracken nodded her head enough to make someone dizzy just by watching. Dolph swept her smoothly up in his arms, and was already halfway up the stairs before she noticed what was happening. Where Bracken recovered quickly, already used to his fanatics, and pointed him down one hall after another. Within a few seconds, they'd made it almost 15 meters, and into a quiet part of the castle in an empty room. Dolph stepped inside, glancing around. Bracken slipped down from his arms. Karam turned around. He hadn't noticed her standing in front of the window, because he was looking for another form entirely. So when she turned to face him, he startled slightly, as if she'd just appeared out of thin air. Dolph blinked at her, the goddess in the room. He focused in on her features. There was something that drew him towards them. Something not enchanting but capturing. There was a mystery here that he felt he had to find out. Karam nodded as she looked at him. "Fetch the Dayak boy." Bracken hurried back out. "Who? Why Dayak? What?" Dolph stuttered. Karam moved towards him, glancing his body up and down. Dolph didn't question her like someone with his abilities might, but instead waited, lost for her to explain herself. After walking around him, she stopped before him, her dress tail circling around him. She tilted her head to the side. "Have you ever wanted to be a girl? Or maybe a bit more buff?" She glanced down him again, even pulling up his shirt to reveal his stomach. Dolph looked around while pulling his shirt back down. "Not really. Do you know where the young Princess Karam is?" "Why wouldn't I?" she replied offhandedly, as she turned back around to the window, and again stood before it. She watched for a moment before asking, "What about your eyes? Another color maybe?" She turned to him again. "Or different hair? Younger? Older?" "No, you said you know where the young princess is. Would you mind telling me?" Karam moved her sight to the door. "Do I need to?" The door opened and Bracken, Geronimo, and Pharrell stepped through the door. Bracken bowed to Karam as she entered and quickly closed the door behind her as she left. Pharrell immediately turned his face to the ground upon noticing Karam. The reaction that one would normally first have after seeing her. He was showing his resignation to her power. Geronimo, on the other hand, watched her with wide childlike interest. Karam motioned him over. "Honey, would you like to come with your fiancé on a little trip?" Karam leaned over with a heavenly smile. Jer's eyebrows jumped. "Are you going?" "Of course. Otherwise, why would I be inviting you?" "Then I want to go. I want to become a big strong man and marry you when I grow up. Miss, if you do, I'll give you all of my followers." Karam's smile grew, but only on the surface. "Don't you mean friends?" She put aside his attempt at cheating for now and turned to Pharrell. "Do you mind, darling? I'll take good care of him." Pharrell hesitated. His head was still bowed, so his face still couldn't be seen, but Karam read right through him. He didn't want to endanger his ties with the kingdom. She always knew he was the kind, loyal type. "Oh, and don't worry about Marak, darling. Just tell him I brought him along, he won't mind." She came up with a name on the spot. "Yes, of course, Miss." Pharrell quickly answered. He bowed deeper. "Let in Bracken on your way out." Karam turned back to Jer, while giving another offhanded order. "Doll, go sit over there now, Jer. Would you like to be a big strong man?" Jer puffed out his chest. "That way I can protect you. You don't need to get hurt anymore." He looked pointedly down at her chest before continuing. "If someone tries to hurt you, then I..." He continued talking, repeating his words in some instances. Karam nodded along with him, not really listening. She reached over to touch a chair and pulled one of Jer's hands into her other palm. First she changed his clothes. She made his blue cat sweater mini skirt, fluffy slippers, and undershirt into a blue poncho dress. She then made him a female. She added some size and age, making sure his clothes were still large enough. Gave him a bit of a bust and shaped him out. Changed his hair, colored his eyes. and tweaked his face. All this time Karam had mostly been covering Dolph's view, who was sitting on a chair in the corner, but not entirely. He watched as the 5-year-old boy turned into a 12-year-old girl. Watched as her hair grew out and turned white. Eyes turned from brown to purple. And listened as her voice changed. Karam glanced down at her hand, which still had about half a chair left. After a second, she fixed up the simple poncho into a luxurious lilac dress. It had long flowy, off-the-shoulder sleeves and a simple lace bottom ending just above her knees. It was a puffy, youthful dress that suited both of her personalities. Karam had 2 chair legs left after a brief pause. She added 3 more white accents. After aging his brain a little, Karam was done. Okay. I'm done now. I'll call you Mimi outside, okay? This is a secret mission to save the world, so don't tell anyone who you really are. Okay. Jo only seemed to notice that something had happened when her head was tweaked near the end. She paused and looked down at the floor. It took a little while and a fit for her to finally comprehend and come to terms about what had just happened. Life formed. The sun was positioned directly above the castle when 4 figures left the castle and boarded an extravagant carriage. The first 2 were a pair of women arm in arm, nearly matching in appearance. From their grace and beauty it was difficult to find the more naturally dressed workers behind them. They were smiling brightly and, to the workers and onlookers, seemed as if goddesses had ascended. Directly to the older woman's side was a guard dressed in light brown. His light grey hair stood out, even under his firm hat. His suit was fashioned after those on Earth, colored only black and white. His fit stature shone through, as if it had been sculpted by the famed goddess herself. His face, kind but striking, was enough to steal any heart, maiden or otherwise. The sword hanging by his waist was entirely made of diamond. He didn't even bother using a sheath, such was his skill. The last figure was the 3rd female in the group. Her clothes were similar in color to her colleges, in black and white. Her short skirt had a pair of thigh highs to exaggerate her fit. Thin legs and her lacy headband stood out as white against her dark grey hair. Her eyes, large and red, were dark against her fair skin, upon which sat an expressionless young face. Their hair, of course, was their mark. Their clothes, their statement. Their stature, their proof of power. And their abilities hidden. There was one last figure to be seen, already waiting at the carriage. As the group of 4 approached, he pushed out of his position and stood to greet them. He didn't bow his head, instead, he shrewdly looked the group over. The only face he recognized was the single male in the group. He nodded to him, Dolph. He then turned to the girl lagging behind the group. T-girl. Then to the woman at the front, unsurprised by his appearance. Princess. He nodded again, then glanced at the girl by her side. If you believe that you can come and snatch her out from underneath my nose, then you have another thing coming. I'm coming with you. The woman's graceful smile didn't falter very well. She nodded to Dolph behind her, who left to fetch a second carriage. You don't seem surprised. Aren't you curious as to how I found out? The king gave you a hint and you figured out the rest. Don't test me, I'm not the little girl you knew. Karam tilted her chin. Rashid lifted an eyebrow at her. Very well. Shall we set off? He went to pull apart the carriage curtains, only to find a delicate hand already holding them gently off to the side. It was Bracken, the girl who was walking behind the group only moments before. Mimi. Karam turned to the girl by her side. Why don't you ride with Dol in the second carriage? Jo nodded, and after exchanging a few words with her father, left to get in the carriage Dolph was guiding around the corner. They were called carriages, but really it was a plank of wood or some other material with cushions on it that was strapped to a large turtle lizard animal. sometimes the more extravagant such as these, had curtains to protect those inside from the elements or prying eyes. Bracken, after waiting for Karam and Rashid to board, hopped on the creature's neck and began guiding it forward. Rashid settled down on his side. His legs bent as he laid because the carriage wasn't wide enough for him to lay properly. He propped himself up using one of the few pillows. This position gave one the perfect view of his narrow waist, as well as his robust legs and arms. He looked up at Karam's ladylike smile, as she sat gracefully across from him. When Dolph made a scene, what had happened was I'd eaten a Greg horn by mistake. It was mixed in with other lookalikes. She spoke slowly, taking her time in front of the anxious Rashid. Eating it gave me a single ability. She glanced down at him, changing forms he offered. Not at all. It gave me the ability to tap into my origins consciousness. She stopped to let her words sink in. Rashid thought about it for a minute. You mean you have the memories of an original? Not exactly. The originals was a word to describe the first living beings on this planet. As you know, this planet began as air and rock. The air became a consciousness and the ground took shape. When the two were bound together, they created something new. A creature made of stone, but with a mind. This is how we came into existence, of course. Everyone knows the story. The consciousness became spiritualists and the ground formers. Karam nodded. Then do you know how new forms are created? She didn't bother waiting for a reply, as she knew the answer. A spiritualist pulls at the air and makes it into a consciousness. Quite a process, actually. But spiritualists' abilities aren't magic. They are controlling their own consciousness through their hands. Because of this, with each work, with each time they use their ability, they leave of themselves behind. If one were to live long enough, they would eventually become a stupid former altogether. Karam smiled. Rashid, of course, was a former, yet he didn't seem to take offense to her words. Formers were always filled with pride about who and what they were, but Rashid was different. For one, Rashid used his head unlike most, so you got some extra consciousness, which made you smarter and able to give out more of yourself, so that you can make and change other forms. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'm only quarter spiritualist, so I didn't have much to begin with. There's nothing to draw out from me. I actually became more former. Rashid blinked. He obviously wasn't comprehending what she was getting at. He sat up. Wait, what more former? Yes. I told you how the ground took shape, didn't I? The original formers were the ones that could make forms, not spiritualists. They did it by molding it directly, much less effective. For example, if one were to pick up a rock and put a few holes in it, then stick on a few legs, you'd have an animal. From the beginning, the ground had the ability to create a form all on its own. That's because ground isn't ground at all. It's microbes. Karam's smile widened and her voice sped up. She was excited, but it wasn't such a large change that most people would grasp that she was acting any differently than she was before. They were simply acting like fire ants during a flood, working together for a common goal. It's really quite intriguing, you know. I'd wondered before why I'd never seen anything crease or age. They work so hard together, giving even their life to holding their shape that they don't give out until the very last second, when they all just suddenly disappear. Karam shrugs. It hadn't made sense until I understood that what we see. Karam transitioned smoothly back into reality. Are living beings working together to create another creature? I mean, it's really in a much simpler way than it was on Earth. So I've come to grasp more of the former in me, not the spiritualist. Rashid was laughing at her earlier, when he saw her speaking excitedly about something he couldn't quite grasp. But now he paused. Formers are buff, strong people. They make their living through brute strength and power. They use force at any time possible. Weapons were seen as cowardly. The more scars one had, the more fame he raised, the bigger the better. Yet a girl, 5-year-old genius to be exact, who'd skimped on her lessons at the academy, was telling him that she was more former than he was. Even if she looked older now, she was still just a petite woman. Her only show of strength was the gnarly scar across her chest Rashid wasn't even sure was real, but apart from that, she was just a beautiful woman, a girl actually. What power could she have? No weight. If formers originally made creatures, then did they have the meaning of what it was to be a former? All wrong. If it wasn't power that created a former, but little insects, then what was a former to begin with? Rashid's head went spinning out of control. On the outside he simply stared at Karam. Well, she shrugged. You're probably the only former in the kingdom who doesn't have to care about all that. Rashid hadn't recovered yet, and was still stuck with his head on other things, so he didn't make the connections he otherwise would have, therefore missing his chance for a witty comeback. What, seeing as you weren't originally a former? I mean, would you like me to give you more spirit? More consciousness so you can live again with the brainiacs and use magic? Karam left that this would have been the perfect time to sip at some tea, while he came back to his senses and made up his mind. As she suspected, he snapped back in a moment. How do you know about that? Rashid was struck dumb. There shouldn't be anyone left who remembers him for that time. Had someone from his past recognized him and begun spreading it around? Was it only her that knew? Did King Marak know? Did this have something to do with their marriage agreement? Was he declining it now that he's found out, or was it the reason for accepting it in the first place? Had he done something rash by tagging along? No. But he couldn't put his trust in them. He wasn't about to let his little boy leave him so soon. Jur was his only proof and meaning of existence. There was no way he was letting him go yet, not yet. Life-ruling Karam looked out past the blinds. If this was her before, she'd have sighed and felt drugged down by how slow he was being. But now she didn't feel anything, she simply felt at peace. She'd felt this way since she woke. She didn't feel one way or another about having eaten the Greg horn or how it changed her. Nor did she feel anything about anything else. She didn't have any desires or wishes. All she knows is that, with everything I've just told you, you think I'm unable to read your form. It was created how spiritualists create other spiritualists. Spiritualists and formers are made differently. I could tell before I even laid eye on you before. Oh yes, I can sense things now. Karam closed her eyes and touched the carriage. Everything is made of the same materials deep down. I can even feel Dolph's mouth moving. Mimi and Dol are talking about why I changed. Dol is explaining to her what happened when I ate the Greg horn. Karam's eyebrow lifted. Looks like Hakase has some sort of magic. Are you pulling my leg? Wait, who? Karam opened her eyes. Where did you learn that saying from? I'm asking if you are making a joke. I know what it means. Where did you learn it? As far as she knew, that was a saying she's found only on Earth. Pharrell came up with it. He thinks of a whole bunch of weird things. Rashid smiled. Karam could feel the happiness seeping off of him. It was obvious he was in love. Karam wanted to feel happy for him. Or at least sad that she didn't love like that anymore, not even Dolph. But she couldn't feel either of those things. Instead, her mind was already moving and deducing from his words even further into the relationship of the three fathers. Oh, I didn't know Parel was so assertive. He came onto you, she observed. Rashid wouldn't be so full of adoration for just any cutie. She didn't tell him about her old world, or that it wasn't Pharrell who'd made up all those weird things. Wait, Rashid was already in another place. I volunteered. But I don't even know what you're doing. Or why you guys are all. Rashid looked Karam up and down. getting his point across with a glance. "We are going undercover, of course you don't need to." Jo didn't need to either. But she most certainly couldn't have left him so young. Who knows what kind of trouble he would get into? Or what she would have to teach him just to get him to obey. There's also the fact that he is technically still her fiancé. She didn't want her fiancé around her copy. Who knows what weird shit they would get into trouble for? Was sex before marriage not allowed, or did they have sex at all? She wasn't sure. She had knowledge galore but culture. She had to learn that step by step. Dolph, after he calmed down from his freak-out, told her she had to either stay or create another Karam to stay in the castle out of thin air. She went for the second option. She'd copied her mind or conscious into a body she'd made to look like the young her and put it inside. Without the power stole granted by the Greg Horn, it'll be like she'd never left. She even made a second Dolph, though that one was admittedly more tricky. Karam couldn't copy any mind apart from her own. She put a consciousness in the fake Dolph and aged it. But that didn't change the fact that it didn't know anything. It was going to have to be led by the nose for the next few years, at least by the Karam copy. While she was at it, she took her other world's memories from her copy and gave her copy a few extra characteristics. Just a few things that will make her more savior of the kingdom's material. It will start manifesting as she grows. She will live her life thinking she's just some genius. She will make up more treats and dream about technology as Embark deems it necessary. It will be released into the world. Her mother and father won't even notice. The sisters might realize something, but Karam wasn't worried. If anything came up, Embark would take care of it. For now she focused on the road ahead. Saving the world. It's going to be a lot easier than she thought. So far, she estimated a week, adding a couple days for any of the problems that might arise. Of course, she's gone over millions of possibilities, and considering each and every single one, she can see everything that's happening and make educated guesses, which are more like divinations, to see how it could possibly play out. Every little thing going on in her kingdom, she knows about, as if she were watching an ant crawl around on her palm. Seeing as their kingdom is the only contact they have and her newfound abilities, she literally has the world in her hand. It's just a matter of pushing the right buttons. At this point, Karam politely smiled to Rashid's question and calmly explained what undercover means. She had the world in her hand, yet she didn't feel the slightest sliver of emotion towards it. One way or another, even without feelings, she would save it. She would do the right thing, because she knew that's what the previous Karam would have done. What she wanted after that, Karam didn't know. But she didn't hate the idea of a golden crown. She didn't hate it at all. END. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the fantastical world of Karam. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to embark on your adventure, and hit the notification bell, so you can be the first to know about the next chapter of Karam's story.